저는 로버트 켈리입니다. 저는 부산대학교 정치학 교수입니다. 안녕하세요. Yes is the short answer. I think if North Korea collapses, I think China would almost certainly intervene, at least to prevent a wave of refugees from North Korea fleeing into China. Again, assuming that North Korea completely falls apart and the government collapses, right? After a war coup or something. Definitely. I also think there's the possibility, and I've seen this in war games and scenarios about North Korean collapse. I think there is a genuine possibility that China and the United States would sort of scramble around North Korea, compete against one another in pursuit of North Korea's nuclear facilities. We don't know how many nuclear weapons the North Koreans have. We don't know how many missiles they have, but they probably have at least 100 nuclear weapons at this point. 50, maybe 100, maybe more. And those would be obviously something that all parties would want to control if North Korea collapsed. China, the United States, South Korea, right? I think in South Korea there's a perception that South Korea would inherit North Korean nuclear weapons. I think America probably wouldn't object to that too much, but I think the Chinese might be worried about that. And I think there is real concern that you might have this kind of scramble to grab North Korean facilities before the other side. Right now, I don't think so. I think if North Korea collapses, yes. I think everybody, I think the United States, China, South Korea, will, like I said, sort of run into North Korea to grab what they can so that rogue North Korean generals or some colonel somewhere starts pushing buttons or, selling weapons to anybody who will buy them. I think there is real concern that if North Korea explodes, it becomes like the Wild West. It's just this wide open space where nobody knows what the rules are. And I think all actors around North Korea, even Russia and Japan, quite honestly, have an interest in everybody getting in there and controlling the place before something terrible happens. But if North Korea is stable, I think a Chinese invasion or a Chinese attack on North Korea is pretty unlikely. The North Koreans and the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians have all grown closer in the last few years because of the Ukraine war. There was a time, I think in the 1990s, when Kim Jong-il was talking to the Americans, right? Your viewers may recall that Madeleine Albright, the American Secretary of State, went to Pyongyang and actually met Kim Jong-il. I believe that was in 1999. And Madeleine Albright has said that Kim did say to her that China was this threat to North Korea, that North Korea wanted nuclear weapons not just because of America and South Korea, but also because of China. Right, and I do think that North Korean-Chinese alliance is not fraternal or affective or genuine or thick, if you will. I think it's like in the way that South Korea and the United States are, right? I mean, South Korea and the United States are friends, right? And there's a lot in the relationship besides just the alliance. I don't think that exists between North Korea and China. I think that relationship is entirely transactional. I think if North Korea gets into a war with the United States or South Korea, China will not help it, because that would pull China into a conflict with the United States, which I don't think the Chinese will make that kind of sacrifice for North Korea. Yeah, I think that, so if China took a buffer in Northern Korea, I don't think it would last too long. I think that any kind of Chinese buffer, any kind of Chinese invasion would only function for a few months, maybe 6 months or something like that. I don't think the Chinese could actually control a significant chunk of North Korea because quite honestly, because Koreans are pretty nationalistic, right? I mean, Koreans would want to be independent, right? And I think if North Korea didn't exist, I think the Americans would be quite comfortable withdrawing or allowing a unified Korea to find their own way. I mean, there's not really much reason for us to be here if North Korea doesn't exist. So I think if North Korea collapsed and South Korea absorbed it, the Americans would be like, fine, you do what you want, right? And you can kick us out, or whatever. It's really your choice. I think America would not want you to have the nuclear weapons, but I think America would more or less respect South Korean sovereignty post-unification. In fact, I think we would probably leave. I think the real issue is China, right? Would China stay, took some of North Korea, and I think that would be very, very difficult because I think a lot of Koreans would be really upset. I think there would probably be rebel movements inside that space. I think there would be a lot of pressure, both within Korea and internationally, for the Chinese to withdraw. So even if the Chinese came in during a crisis to prevent nuclear proliferation or terrorism, I don't think the Chinese would stay. Remember in the 1950s, the Chinese army, the PLA, was out of North Korea. Kim Il-sung managed to get the PLA out of North Korea by, I think, 1956, right? Even though there was like 1 million Chinese in the middle of Korea in 1953, 3 years later they were gone. I don't think the Chinese would stay. That would be very, very difficult, I think. Yeah, I think so. In fact, I think the North Koreans have always been really concerned about this, right? I mean, I think South Korean grand strategy generally, going back centuries, if you will, has always been concerned about becoming a Chinese satellite or sort of falling into China's orbit too much, right? And I think it's been sort of a challenge for Korean elites to live with China while also keeping Korean sovereignty. And to be fair to North Korea, I think the North Koreans have done a pretty good job of actually preventing North Korea from becoming a satellite of China, right? I mean, if you look at Eastern European countries after 1945, they all became satellites of the Soviet Union, right? East Germany, Poland, Bulgaria, all these countries, their communist political elites were very, very dependent on the USSR and the Red Army. And Kim Il-sung was pretty determined not to have that happen to North Korea, right? And so Kim Il-sung was pretty smart. Today, I think the real threat for North Korea in the long term is what this question suggests, which is that North Korea doesn't really have any other patrons. Soviet Union is gone, right? And so it could be that North Korea slides slowly towards becoming an economic colony of China. There is already analysis that argues that North Korea wouldn't exist without Chinese support. That's probably true, I don't know. But I think this is one reason why the North Koreans built nuclear weapons, right? We talk a lot about the nuclear weapons aimed at the Americans or South Korea or whatever, and that's all true, right? But I think one reason, and I think Kim Jong-il hinted at this with Madeleine Albright, is that one reason why the North Koreans were building nuclear weapons was to defend their sovereignty against China, right? So even if North Korea becomes economically dependent on China, which it probably is, politically, North Korea could still guarantee its sovereignty, it could still guarantee its autonomy and ability to act independently because its nuclear weapons you were sort of a way to blunt Chinese influence. No, I don't think that's correct. First of all, the North Korean public isn't really that relevant. I mean, they're completely locked out of politics. North Korea is a complete elite game, right, at the very, very top of the state, conducted among maybe a few thousand people, maybe 10 or 20. Yeah, I mean, politics in North Korea is a very, very narrow game. So what the North Korean people think about China, quite honestly, is irrelevant for North Korean policy, which is terrible to say, but it's true. So what really matters is what North Korean elites think about China. And no, I think the North Korean elite is actually quite conscious of how dependent they are on China. Like I said, I think that's one reason why they built the nuclear weapons, right? The nuclear weapons help keep North Korea from falling into anyone's orbit. China, South Korea, the United States, Japan, whatever. Certainly Kim Jong-un, I think, has been responsive when China pushes. So, for example, back in, I think, 2018? And so in 2017, Donald Trump was talking about fire and fury, and everybody thought there was going to be a war. That's what people were saying 7 years ago. And so in 2018, I think the Chinese were genuinely concerned that Trump might actually start a conflict in Korea. And the Chinese kind of twisted the arm of Kim Jong-un. They sort of, if I remember correctly, they beckoned him to come to Beijing, and Kim Jong-un went twice. If I remember, Kim Jong-un went twice to Beijing in 2018. And it looks like, I mean, we don't know, but it looks like the Chinese told him, you got to go and talk to Donald Trump because we don't want to have a war in Northeast Asia, right? And Kim Jong-un did that. Now, he didn't actually give Trump, he actually kind of gave him nothing, but I do think the Chinese were genuinely concerned about a war in 2017, 18, and they did communicate this to Kim Jong-un and say, you need to go and talk to Trump because if you don't, we might cut you off or we might pull back some of our political support. Certainly, when I went to North Korea, I went back in 2011, and we went to the Arirang Mass Games, in Pyongyang. We saw that for 2 days, I believe we went. And it was filled with parades and balloons and signs about how wonderful China was and how great the relationship was, right? And all that is because North Korea is pretty weak, right? I mean, the North Korean system doesn't function internally very well, right? When North Korea stands alone, like it did in the late 1990s, after the Soviet Union disappeared and before Chinese assistance, right? North Korea stood alone from like the mid-90s until around 2000. It went through a terrible famine. Something like 10% of the population died. I mean, a lot of people thought North Korea was going to collapse. So North Korea either has to change internally so it can function better on its own, but that would mean loosening the autocracy, which the regime doesn't want to do for obvious reasons, or right? So if you can't change internally, then what that means is you need an external patron. And so now the North Korean primary patron is China, right? And I think the North Koreans are pretty aware that if they upset the Chinese too much, the Chinese could enforce the sanctions, for example, right? Not permit energy imports, things like that. The Chinese kind of look the other way a lot on the sanctions. So like when I flew from Beijing to North Korea, you could see people walking onto the plane violating the sanctions. So part of the sanctions is a luxury ban. You're not allowed to bring in like diamonds and alcohol and stuff like that. And you could see people just walking straight from the duty-free in the Beijing National Capital Airport. They would walk straight from duty-free right onto the plane to North Korea. And they were carrying bags and bags of like liquor and cigarettes and toasters and hair dryers, and all that violated the sanctions, right? And the Chinese were just like, we don't care. And so I think the North Koreans are aware of that, right? If the Chinese really wanted to enforce the sanctions, North Korea would be in real trouble. So yeah, I do think the North Koreans are quite aware of Chinese influence. I don't think so. Although that might be changing because the Russia-North Korea relationship has actually thickened significantly in the last 2 years because of the Ukraine war. I think it's pretty well understood now, right, that the Russians are importing ammunition from the North Koreans, right? You got to wonder if that ammunition actually works, right? But the Russians are buying ammunition from the North Koreans, and it looks like they're going to trade to the North Koreans military technology, probably satellite and missile technology for North Korean guidance for North Korean missiles, right? We don't know if the North Koreans can actually guide a missile to a target, and so we think that the Russians will give them that kind of assistance, which of course would be really bad, by the way. But previous to the Ukraine war, I think that the Russian position in East Asia is actually pretty weak. I mean, the last time that the Russians were actually pretty big out here was in the 1980s when the Soviet Union existed, and then the Soviet Union was on a major naval buildup because it was concerned about a potential conflict with the US and Japan. Right, but a lot of that, a lot of those Russian warships have simply rusted away in the Far East. Most of Russia's military capability is focused in the West, especially now because the Ukraine war is going poorly for the Russians. So I think the real issue is China. I think the Russians are basically like a side actor. So I would argue no, that until the Ukraine war, it was really the real issue for us is Chinese support for North Korea, right? And we tried for a while to get the Chinese to have some distance from North Korea. Park Geun-hye. Nobody likes Park Geun-hye anymore, but at the time, I actually thought her foreign policy towards China was correct. She was trying to sort of flatter Xi Jinping. She was going to Beijing all the time, trying to flatter Xi Jinping, and the idea was to sort of pull China away, right, to sort of like wedge China away from North Korea, and I think that was actually right. I mean, all that got overtaken by all of her scandals and problems and stuff like that. The new interesting question is whether or not the Ukraine war will be some kind of major revolution between the Russians and the North Koreans. If you're the North Koreans, I bet that's what you really want, right? Because if the Russians are coming to you and they're buying ammunition and need artillery and whatever, right, then that suddenly means you can go to the Russians and talk to them about technology, finance, and stuff like that, and that means you're less dependent on China. Again, if you're North Korea, what you want to do is have a choice between your patron, right? You want to talk a little bit to South Koreans, maybe you can talk to the Americans, Donald Trump, you can talk to the Chinese somewhat, now you get to talk to the Russians, right? As long as there's multiple players looking for North Korean favor, North Korea is not dependent on any one state, right? That's the real trick of your North Korea, right? Is to sort of prevent dependence on one entity, China. Because then the Chinese can kind of tell you what to do. And so the Ukraine war is to North Korea's benefit very much because it brings Russia back into play because the Russians are really desperate for ammunition. They can't buy directly from China because the Americans have been telling the Chinese you can't get in the war. That'll destroy the US-Chinese relationship. But the North Koreans don't care what the Americans think, and they're happy to export ammunition to the Russians. And so if you're North Korea, that has much bigger strategic value because, like I said, you can draw some distance from China. And that's actually a really good question. I think there's a greater possibility of Chinese intervention. Certainly Russia shares the same goals that everybody else shares post-collapse, which is to make sure the nuclear weapons don't just kind of disappear, right? I mean, that's the big concern. If North Korea falls apart, right, will military officers from the Korean People's Army, the Chosun Inmingun, will they like take them and get in a boat and like sail off to Southeast Asia or something like that, right? Or will they sell them to Iran or Al-Qaeda or something like that? There's a lot of concern that if North Korea sort of blows up or implodes, right, it becomes like the Wild West, and then nobody knows what happens to the missile parts, to the warheads, right? Like, where does all this stuff go? And I think the Russians, the Americans, the South Koreans, the Japanese, China, everybody has an interest in that stuff staying in the hands of reasonably responsible actors. I don't want the Russians to get North Korea's nuclear weapons, but I would certainly prefer that to a North Korean colonel running off with those weapons and selling them to like Iran in the middle of the night, you know, whatever, right? And I think that's the real concern. So I think the Russians have an interest in preventing the worst outcomes of a North Korean collapse. I think Russia's military ability to intervene in Russia is very limited because the Russian military is pretty weak out here, and of course they're getting weaker because the Ukraine war hasn't gone well for Russia. But I do think that Russia would probably support Chinese intervention, and I do think Russia would support the general concern that both the Americans and the Chinese have to lock down all of this stuff, right? What would actually happen in North Korea? Who would actually govern it? Would you have immediate unification? All those things would be subject to political discussion, right? That would be pretty difficult. But the core issue of North Korea's arsenal, where would it go? Who would get it? I think all players, everybody, has an interest in that material remaining in the hands of elites who are responsible to a government, as opposed to just rogue actors running around with this stuff. That's what I really worry about. Yes, that's a good question too, and I think a lot of that is because of Ukraine. I mean, we don't know if the Ukraine war is going to lead to like a big sort of revolution in world affairs, but I do think the Ukraine war is driving together these dictatorships to cooperate more. I think at this point it's pretty well understood that Russia, Iran, and North Korea are all selling weapons, drones, artillery, right, spare parts, and so on to the Russians to fight the war. And they all really want the Russians to win, and they're helping them. And we in the West, South Korea and Japan also, right, are helping Ukraine, right, providing lots and lots of ammunition and all kinds of other stuff. The Koreans have been a part of that, which is great. And so I think there is this possibility that you'll get these sort of like two competitive blocks, right? We call that bipolarity. We saw that during the Cold War. I mean, the good news on that, if you're South Korea, is that that relationship, just like North Korea's relationship with China, will be almost certainly transactional, right? There's no deep, committed relationship here, right? It's all at the very top. It's elites talking to each other, making trades. This is different than a lot of the relationships between like Western countries where you have a lot of interaction below the elite level. You have like student exchanges and tourism and people learning languages and stuff like that, and a lot of, you know, exchange of you know, people and ideas and culture and stuff like that. And you see that between the United States and South Korea, right? And so that kind of thick relationship, the kind of sub-governmental relationship that makes the U.S. relationship with South Korea really genuine, that doesn't exist, right? All of them oppose American dominance. All of them see the contest with Ukraine as sort of pushing the United States back and making the world more multipolar. And so while they may need one another transactionally in the short term, I don't actually think that if their interests diverge much, that any kind of an alliance or a relationship would survive, right? Whereas on, you know, I contrast that with like the United States and South Korea, right? When Donald Trump was president, right, Donald Trump came to South Korea and he said all kinds of stuff like South Koreans are terrible people. I mean, he actually said that, right? You know, and like South Koreans are free riders and, you know, we should leave, and he wants to blow up the alliance and whatever, right? And when Moon Jae-in was president, Moon Jae-in was like, you know, we need the Americans to kind of get out of the way so we can go and talk to the North. I mean, you had two presidents in South Korea and the United States who really didn't like each other, right? Couldn't really be in the same room with each other. But the relationship stayed together because below that, there's a lot of other stuff going on. And that's what you don't have in this relationship, right? So the U.S.-South Korea relationship survived the turbulence of the Trump period because it isn't just elites. It's not just diplomats talking to each other. There's lots and lots of other stuff going on, right? All that thickens and fills out the relationship so it isn't just a bunch of diplomats swapping stuff, right? And so that's the good news, right? That, you know, the relationship will get more solid as you ask, but it won't actually rival the kind of thick, affective relationships that you see among the democracies, where the democracies really trust each other, they want to work together, they believe they're in a community, right? You know, the autocracies will never share that kind of like thick bond. That is all for today. If you like the content, please subscribe to our channel and set the notification to on. Thank you very much. 감사합니다.